Welcome back, Deep Divers. Ready for another plunge into some seriously fascinating but admittedly kind of dark territory.
Always up for a challenge, especially when it comes to uncovering the more hidden aspects of human nature.
Well, today we're wading into the chilling world of serial killers. Using some really insightful info from psychology today, our goal is to, cut through the hype and really try to grasp the psychological and factual realities behind this phenomenon.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction. You see so much sensationalism surrounding these cases, so a grounded, sort of evidence-based approach is crucial.
Exactly. So we'll be diving into the definitions, the psychology, the motivations behind these acts, and even touch on that weird societal fascination we all seem to have with these disturbing stories. So ready to unpack this unsettling phenomenon.
Absolutely. Let's get into it. I think Psychology Today offers a solid framework for starting this exploration, a way to kind of move beyond just the headlines and the horror and try to understand the complexity of it all.
Yeah, for sure. So first things first, what exactly defines a serial killer? Like, what are the non-negotiables, according to this article?
Okay, so the generally accepted definition, at least as it's laid out here, is someone who commits at least 3 murders.
Okay, 3 or more.
Right, but there's more to it than just the number. These murders have to occur over a period of more than a month, and this is important, with a cooling-off period between each killing.
So it's not like a one-time rampage, it's spread out.
Precisely. And some criminal psychologists even argue that there needs to be a specific kind of deviant psychological motive driving these murders. It can't just be, any 3 murders over time.
So like a specific psychological element beyond just the violence itself.
Right. They might point to things like, sexual gratification or a desire for power and control as being part of that equation. So it's not just about the body count. It's this pattern of behavior coupled with a potentially disturbing psychological drive.
That definitely adds a whole other level of, creepiness to it, to be honest. So that's a serial killer. But the article also talked about mass murderers and how they're different. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. The simplest way to distinguish them is by looking at the timeline. Serial killers, like we said, operate over an extended period with these significant breaks between their crimes. Mass murderers, on the other hand, commit all their murders within a single event, a concentrated burst of violence.
Like, say, a school shooting, for example.
Exactly. The article uses that very example. It's a horrific, one-time event, as opposed to a pattern of killings spread out over time.
Gotcha. So time is really the key differentiator here, the duration and the pauses. Now, geographically speaking, are serial killers, found everywhere, or are they concentrated in certain parts of the world?
Well, according to Psychology Today, they've been identified in most countries and on 6 continents.
Wow, so it's not a regionally specific thing at all.
Right, but here's where it gets interesting. The article points out that there seems to be a higher number reported in Western countries, especially in the U.S.
Why do you think that is?
Well, one theory is that it's not necessarily that there are actually more serial killers in these places, but that there are more sophisticated law enforcement methods for detecting and, of course, way more media coverage. So it might be a matter of perception rather than a true difference in prevalence.
Makes you wonder, right? How many cases might go undetected in places with fewer resources or less media attention? And that even brings up the historical context, right? Like, how were these repeated acts of violence understood before we had terms like, serial killer?
Oh, that's a fascinating point. Before modern psychology and criminology, such acts were often attributed to supernatural forces, like tales of monsters or werewolves or even, demonic possessions.
Right, like explanations rooted in folklore and superstition rather than individual psychology.
Exactly, and it really highlights how dramatically our understanding of human behavior, especially extreme behavior, has evolved. Now, the article mentions Jack the Ripper as this sort of key figure in the history of, our understanding of serial killers. What's the significance there?
Yeah, he's like a household name, even though, we never caught him, right?
Exactly. Jack the Ripper, terrorizing London back in the late 19th century. He's often called the first modern serial killer because his crimes, even though unsolved, really fit the pattern we now recognize. The repeated killings, the specific types of victims he targeted, the whole, media frenzy around it, it all kind of created a template, even before we had a name for it.
So he sort of captured the public imagination in a way that hadn't happened before.
Precisely, and that paved the way for the term serial killer to eventually emerge.
So when did that term actually come into common usage?
The article says it really gained traction in the latter half of the 20th century, coinciding with increased media attention on these kind of cases and more dedicated efforts by law enforcement to categorize and understand these offenders.
Right. The more we focus on something, the more we need the language to describe it. Now, the article also breaks down serial killers based on their motivations. Can you walk us through those different categories?
Sure. It outlines 4 main types: visionary, mission-oriented, hedonistic, and power control.
Okay, 4 distinct types. So let's start with visionary. What drives them?
Visionary killers believe they're acting on orders from some higher power, could be God, demons, some other entity. This type can be linked to, underlying mental health conditions like schizophrenia or psychosis.
So they're driven by a delusion, basically.
In a sense, yes. Then you have the mission-oriented killers. They feel a duty to eliminate certain groups they perceive as undesirable or, immoral. The article gives the example of sex workers, but it could be any group they've, fixated on.
So it's a twisted sense of justice.
Yeah, exactly. Then there are the hedonistic killers who, as the name suggests, derive pleasure from the act of killing itself. This could be sexual or just the thrill and excitement of the violence.
That's a tough one to wrap your head around. And lastly, we have the power control type. What's their primary motivation?
For them, it's all about dominating and controlling their victims. It's about exerting ultimate power in, the most horrifying way imaginable.
So it's a spectrum, right? From this external force driving the visionary killers to this deep internal drive in the hedonistic and power control types. Now, this brings up a question that I think a lot of people wonder about. Are all serial killers mentally ill?
That's a common assumption, but the article makes an important distinction. While some may exhibit signs of psychosis or severe mood disorders, very few are actually found to be legally insane.
Okay, so insane in the legal sense is different from having a mental illness.
Right. The more consistent psychological feature they exhibit is extreme antisocial behavior.
And what does that mean exactly?
It means a profound lack of empathy, no remorse, a blatant disregard for laws and social norms. And often there's this deep-seated desire for revenge, either against individuals or society as a whole.
So it's this fundamental inability to connect with others on an emotional level. And how do the terms psychopath and sociopath fit into all of this?
The article explains that many serial killers do meet the criteria for these diagnoses, which can ultimately lead to a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder.
So those terms are often used interchangeably, but they basically describe this pattern of manipulative, callous behavior.
Exactly, and it stems from that same lack of empathy we talked about.
Now, in movies and TV shows, serial killers are often portrayed as these criminal masterminds, right? Like super intelligent, cunning, the evil genius stereotype. Does the article support that?
Actually, it debunks that myth pretty clearly. The reality is that most serial killers have average IQs. Just like any population group, you'll have some with lower intelligence, some with higher, but the majority fall right in the middle.
So it's not about being a genius, but maybe more about being, really skilled at manipulating people, exploiting their weaknesses?
Right. Their intelligence might be average, but their capacity for cruelty and deception is anything but.
Chilling. Now let's talk nature versus nurture. Does the article shed light on whether serial killers are, born this way or if it's their environment that shapes them?
As with most complex human behaviors, it seems to be a combination of both. The article highlights that a large number of serial killers have experienced severe childhood trauma, abuse, neglect. So that points to a strong environmental influence.
Right. A deeply troubled upbringing.
Exactly, but it also acknowledges that there's a strong genetic component to antisocial personality disorder. So there could be a biological predisposition in some individuals, making them more susceptible to developing those extreme tendencies.
So it's likely this interplay of genes and environment, a perfect storm of vulnerability and trauma. Are there any, early warning signs, things that might suggest someone is on this path?
The article does mention some potential red flags. Obviously, a history of trauma or neglect is a big one. And, some might show early signs of delinquent behavior. There's also the McDonald triad, this cluster of behaviors that has been historically linked to potential for violence.
What is that exactly, the McDonald triad?
It includes animal cruelty, fire setting, and bedwetting. But it's important to note that, not all serial killers killers exhibit these behaviors, and conversely, the vast majority of kids who do any of those things don't become serial killers.
Right, so it's not a foolproof predictor by any means.
Exactly, just a potential indicator that might warrant attention in the right context.
Now, shifting gears a bit, we tend to think serial killers as almost exclusively male. Does the article address female serial killers at all?
It does, and it emphasizes that they absolutely exist, challenging that stereotype. Estimates suggest they make up around 15% of cases.
15%, that's more than I would have guessed, to be honest. Are there any key differences between how male and female serial killers operate?
There are some interesting potential differences. The article points out that female serial killers seem less likely to be motivated by sexual urges and more often driven by things like financial gain. They also tend to prefer less messy, less confrontational methods of killing.
Like what? Poison, for instance?
Exactly. Poisoning is a common one. They also seem more likely to act with a male partner. The article mentions cases like, Karla Homolka and Myra Hindley, those notorious partnerships.
Fascinating. Really flips the script on how we tend to imagine these offenders. Now, let's get to something that I've always found kind of perplexing. Why are we so fascinated by serial killers? It's such a dark subject, and yet we're drawn to these stories. What does the article say about that?
Well, it suggests that this fascination, while seemingly morbid, isn't necessarily unhealthy. It could stem from this innate human need to understand the unknown, to try and make sense of something so far outside our normal experience. And maybe, by understanding it, we feel a bit safer, like we can better protect ourselves.
So it's like by confronting these dark realities, even indirectly, we somehow feel more in control.
Possibly. And it also might be a way to safely explore those darker thoughts and impulses that we all have to some degree. We get to experience them through stories in a controlled environment.
So like a psychological pressure valve.
Exactly. And the article points to a neurological basis for this fascination as well. It mentions that our brains are wired to pay attention to danger, to calamity. True crime, especially stories about serial killers, can trigger an adrenaline response, which can actually be pleasurable when we know we're safe.
Oh, like a controlled dose of fear. And speaking of fear, that fact that serial killers often seem completely normal before they're caught, that must add to the fascination, right?
Absolutely. It makes them seem even more terrifying, and it fuels this desire to learn the signs, to try to identify them before it's too late.
Right, like we can somehow protect ourselves by figuring out the secret formula. And I mean, there's so much true crime content out there, books, movies, podcasts like this one, that clearly speaks to this widespread interest.
It does, and the article suggests that this media serves to fulfill that fascination, that need to confront the darkness, but in a safe way.
It's like a simulated experience of fear and horror.
Yeah, you think to grapple with these heavy themes, but from a distance, which might even lead to a sense of psychological safety, because you're gaining knowledge, understanding, even about something so disturbing.
Knowledge is power, as they say. The article also takes the time to debunk some common myths about serial killers. What are some of the big ones?
Well, first off, it reiterates that they're not all criminal masterminds. Most have average intelligence, as we discussed. It also emphasizes that not all serial killers are men.
Right. Female serial killers are a very real and disturbing phenomenon.
Absolutely. And finally, it dispels the myth that they're all loners. Many have families, jobs, seem perfectly normal to those around them.
Which is, I guess, part of what makes them so terrifying. They blend in.
Exactly. It's that mask of normalcy that can be so unsettling.
Now, the article touches on something that I find particularly disturbing, this phenomenon of people, developing relationships with incarcerated serial killers. Why would anyone do that? What's the psychology there?
The motivations are complex and often quite troubling. Some people seem to want to nurture or understand the killer, maybe stemming from their own issues or a misguided belief that they can somehow change them. Others might be drawn to the notoriety, the infamy.
So like a twisted form of fandom.
Yeah, there's an element of that for some. And then there are the even more disturbing theory about a deep-seated attraction to power, even in its most perverse form.
That's a really dark side to this whole phenomenon. Finally, the article touches on the broader societal impact of serial killers. What kind of ripple effects do these crimes have?
They can generate a lot of fear and anxiety in communities. It often leads to, increased policing, new security measures, a general erosion of trust. Some sociologists even argue that serial killers, by representing the ultimate transgression, actually reinforce our societal boundaries of good and evil.
So by embodying pure evil, they help us define what good is?
In a sense, yes. It's a complex and disturbing idea, but worth considering.
Absolutely. Well, we've definitely taken a deep dive here, haven't we? We've explored the definitions, the psychology, those complex motivations, and even our own strange fascination with this dark corner of human behavior.
We have, and I think that highlights just how multi-layered this phenomenon really is. There's so much more to it than those simplistic portrayals we often see in media.
For sure. So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. We've talked about our natural curiosity, about the dark side of humanity, but it's important to remember that, there's a responsibility that comes with that curiosity. We can't glorify these acts or in any way, enable them. So the question is, what does our fascination with serial killers, despite the horror of their crimes, ultimately say about us as a society? That's something we all need to reflect on. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time, keep diving deep.